fairly political family who's been, and I've always been interested in voting rights and political mobilization and organizing. And when I had previous careers before I was an academic that were in these in different ways. And when I decided to be, come to academia, and I was working on graduate work and was an aspiring historian at that point, or maybe I was a junior historian. I don't know. I was getting there. It just fit. I'm gonna actually do a shout out. At the time, I had done my master's work on women clubs and organizing in Corpus Christi. And there's a historian that's with us in addition who Seal has worked a lot on Corpus Christi history, but Mary Jo Arrear's here with us as well. And this wasn't planned, but we're glad to see her. Who has also done a lot of work in Corpus Christi, and I had done things on women's club work in Corpus. And when I went on to get my doctorate, my dissertation advisor, I was looking for topics, and I was kind of interested in this, and I'm interested in politics. And we kind of, started looking into things. And when I really started looking at, my dissertation advisor, Elizabeth Hayes Turner, said, she says, Jess, why don't you go look into these things? And it's kind of what I was already doing. And I had a background specialization in it, but from a different angle, not as a historian, but someone who had worked in it and been raised in it. And, it just made a lot of sense. So I started digging around and realized, and I realized because I was coming to history at that point, not because historians didn't know this already, that Texas had been the first Southern state to ratify the 19th Amendment. And it being worked in politics, my family being somewhat political and holding office in Texas for quite some time in some way, shape, or form, like centuries kind of roll over and that kind of thing, I started thinking, really? Well, how'd that happen? And so as a historian, I started digging, and my main area is actually women, gender, and sexuality. So that was what called me to it, and kind of how went into that direction. And I've been working on history of that subject in some way, shape, or form for almost 20 years. And so I like it, obviously, and I'm interested in it, and I think it's important. And the centennial is highlighting these things in a different way, I believe, and a lot of other things that are going on in the world are. But that's how I kind of came to it, that it's something that I was exposed to as a young person. I think we're going to talk about this too later as a group in a way, because I think that's a really important thing. I was exposed to as a young person and exposed to in earlier career choices, and as an academic, as a historian, wanted to know more about, but in the past. And so that's how I came to this.
Well, for me, I grew up in Mexico City, and my father was an American man. And so living in Mexico City, he was never able to vote. He was not a Mexican citizen, but he was very engaged politically. And in Mexico, we have more than 2 parties. We have about 10. And so, each of them has an emblem, and each of them has a credos and all these things. And so he would tell me, for instance, the little rooster, what political party is that? And I would be like, oh, that's this party. And what is their belief? And I would be like, oh, it's this. So it was almost like a game. It was almost like a loteria type game that he played with me. But I didn't realize it at the time. He was making me a political human being. And I didn't know at the time that women had faced so many restrictions, and that the path to voting had been so limited, because he made it so seamless, so open. He never thought, oh, she's 7. She's never going to get what's the difference between this party and this party. He just made it like a conversation. And my mom always voted. And so for me, it was just one of the things that you do, like brushing your teeth and having breakfast, So I agree, Jessica, that when it's integrated as part of our education, when it's integrated as part of our natural family traditions, then you rear voters. Voters rear voters. That's how it is.
Part of the interviews that Joy did on her online exhibit it was actually originally a radio series, and there's an online exhibit we can still have access that's online with the Texas Standard. I think there was a number of those stories where people said the same thing, right, Joy?
Absolutely. I mean, most of them were like, this is what my family did, and I became political because my family was political. But there's also the path of I had to become engaged because injustice, right?
Yes.
So it's those two schools, I guess.
So, as I was saying, came to this similar to Jessica. I looked at women's history. I've looked at women's clubs and organizations, but I started looking at African-American women and their voting. And I found that even though, we're supposed to be able to vote, African-American women weren't. And so it's kind of sparked my interest into looking at voting for different groups of people and how maybe they weren't allowed to vote. But I wanted to also see how much that they pushed to make sure that they eventually were able to get the right to vote. And so that was kind of my interest, and to look at some of the strategies that they used to get that right. So that's how I came to the subject.
In your family and in your culture, how did you learn about voting, and what did it mean to you? If you didn't already answer this question in the first one, if you have anything else to say about your family and your culture and what voting meant, I'd love to hear about it.
Well, I'll lead off. So I was born on the south side of Chicago, and my dad was born in Eagle Pass, and he lived in Piedras Negras. But when he came, he eventually moved to the United States, and he went on the migrant trail with his family. Eventually he makes it up to Chicago, and he, gets a job at a factory. My mother spent World War II in Europe. So when she came, all she had was what she had on her back, and she eventually grew up and also had, got a job at the factory. So why I'm telling you all of this personal stuff is because this is, my parents were not, rich or not, they were relatively poor when we were born. And, but every election year, Mayor Daley, who was the mayor of Chicago and ran an effective political machine, they came and they sent the aldermen to our house, and they picked us up and they took us to baseball games or to the circus or, wherever. And I mean, this was the first time we got to go to any of these kind of things. But what it left me with was that my parents, although my dad was multiracial, we were poor, our vote mattered because they came to our house and they encouraged us. I mean, they took us out, but it was also to affect my parents to go out to vote. And so that's why it left me with the importance of voting, because it doesn't matter your ethnicity or your education or your political standing, or, of course they wanted you to vote Democratic, but, they weren't with you in the voting box. So, that's why it left me with an importance of the reason to vote.
And I wanted to share that my family story is in a way similar to yours, Cecilia, because my grandfather on my mom's side, he was a farmer. And if you guys know the story of braceros during World War II, those farmers, 5 million farmers that we brought from Mexico to the United States, and we called them workers, but we truly treated them like slaves. Well, my grandfather was one of them. And he would come to the United States every year, once a year, and then he would go back to Mexico once a year. So funny story, actually, out of my 8 aunts and uncles, all of them have August birthdays, and you can do the math. that he would come in December and all the babies would be born at the end of August once a year. And so all of them. And from him, I learned the importance of voting, because the party that he voted for was a party that would support agricultural workers. That was their main agenda: land for agricultural workers, healthcare for agricultural workers. And he saw the benefits of that, right? He saw it materialize with his vote. And I also learned the beauty of loyalty to a party that truly supports you. You know, he was an old man and he would tell me stories. He would be like, I will not vote for anybody who does not have an agricultural platform. Whoa, imagine, you know, like how powerful that is. And so in my family, it became important. From way back, as you were saying, it didn't matter if they were rich or poor, you realized that your vote mattered.
Yeah. Well, I got on the other side. My mom's family, they grew up in a communist country. So again, we know I've learned the stories of why it's important to have voting, because you're in a communist country, you don't have that right. And so you don't have a say. And so that's, makes a big difference on the world that you live in.
Have you experienced any barriers to voting? But I'm sure that in your research, you learned about other people encountering barriers to voting in Texas. Can you say a little bit more about what you've learned, Joy, possibly in the interviews with some of the women you talked to, and Jessica and Cecilia in your research?
Yeah, every time I have to do a story and people, who are not from Texas are like, but there's really very few barriers to voting, right? And I'm like, well, when you do a story, a national story, they're surprised at how easy it is to find people who cannot vote for one reason or another.
Oh.
Some of the reasons, can you hear me? And some of the reasons are, for instance, I've interviewed people who have aged out of foster care. And one of the challenges of aging out of foster care, by law, the state needs to give you 3 forms of ID. They need to give you your state ID. They need to give you a driver's license. They need to give you a birth certificate. Those are things that kids need to leave the system with. And why? Well, because you need these things to register to vote. You need these things to become a grown-up. But a lot of children in the foster care system age out without these documents. They are, for lack of a better word, undocumented Americans, right? And so how do you vote if you have no documents? Another barrier that I have learned when I've interviewed people is, a prison record. Another one is being born, whether it's for religious reasons or for any other reasons, giving birth at home and not having a birth certificate. For some people, it is not a priority to get a birth certificate. For others, there's several barriers to getting a birth certificate. So that is a barrier to voting. And when you learn about these stories, when I interview people, because a lot of times when people say, well, it's not that hard to get an ID. No, it's not that hard for you. or for me, but it is very difficult for a lot of people.
That's one of the, as Joy brought up, that's one of those things that everybody assumes everybody has a computer, everybody has online, everybody doesn't have, and everybody is not literate with the computer. So we have to be very cognizant of what the pressures that we put on people, because at some point it's not possible. And especially now with, you would go to your library and you would get people at the library. Well, the libraries are closed now. So what do you do? It's one of those barriers that average people do not consider. But I wanted to say in 2016, when I went to vote, there was a cop car outside of my polling place. They're not supposed to be a cop car outside the polling place because of the intimidation factor. For me, average people, it doesn't make any difference, but some people are very intimidated and they will not go into a voting poll, to vote. So, but I did talk to the people there, and they did get it removed, and I had no problem. But it's one of those things that it's part of the voter suppression that'll some people want to use.
So I'm hyphenated in my legal name with my maiden name and my husband's last name, and there's a lot of letters and it causes issues because I have a middle name on top of the hyphenation, and I have had a couple of times where I was questioned because my photo ID does not provide the room for my entire middle name. And trust me when I say there's not a lot of Brannon-Wranoskys running around out there, so it's not about that. Especially wherever it is I'm living at the moment, there's nobody, and so, but I've still been questioned and had to handle that. But it speaks to the larger sense of names and IDs and varies in that way. As far as my research is concerned, though, that's much more about what the information that I have access to and I know. And there's an infinite amount of stories for the way that voting restriction and barriers work. And some of them are designed specifically to work that way, where there's segregation and restriction, for example, within the suffrage movement. Some of the things that women's suffrage movement, some of the things that we're talking about more and more in the last few years, and I'll say historians have been talking about it longer, but in the larger public discussions in connection to historians, that there's segregation within suffrage associations, there's segregation within the movements, there's restrictions, there's people not being allowed, it's discriminatory, and there were things specifically designed that way for a mixture of, that it was white political purpose in order to mobilize white men on behalf of women. I'm not going to say that was not necessarily a political strategy that those white male voters and legislators expected during those years, because I think that's just idealistic and wrong. That yes, but it's not just for that. That there were plenty of women suffragists who were invested in a segregated and discriminatory vote, or a segregated and discriminatory access to suffrage associations as well. And we look at that and I'm like, oh, well, what is that? It's club membership, but that's also information and it's training and it's access. And it also means those individuals that are lobbying as large organizations for the way that laws are written, or keeping an eye on the way laws are written, or who are advising on the way laws are written, are doing so with the idea, or at least with being informed by, or invested in, that they're limited by, whoever it was at whatever time, but being informed by a discriminatory perspective. And that means that they're not keeping an eye on the way that laws need to be written, or the things that need to be asked, or they don't think that they have the ability. In some cases, we see that where we see women suffrage leaders, they added this thing to, or this rider to this law at the last minute, which required literacy requirements, or it required all sorts of things, and we didn't want that there, but we couldn't fight it. And so we have to take them for what they're saying. We can't say, oh, could you really fight it? Because you can't wish 21st century procedures on 19th and 20th century actions. But what you can do is realize that it's still a choice not to fight it. Mm-hmm. And that they're making determinations, and they're making choices about priority. Beyond all that, though, or not beyond that, connected to all of that, is also information within those exchanges. I want to give a specific example. Actually, two. We talk about in Texas that there was never a literacy requirement associated with voting, and which is technically accurate in a way, in that voter laws that addressed the large percentage of voters did not specifically have what we would call a literacy test that was written into that kind of wording. But there's two ways that's actually not accurate. And this is in textbooks. This is what political scientists say. This is what historians say. But actually, that's not accurate, because one, any written ballot is a literacy test.
Right.
Anything you have to read and then write on is a literacy test, period. Now, it's a minor literacy test, But if you cannot have assistance in either translating that document into the primary language that that voter speaks, or that that person, for whatever reason, cannot read that ballot. So that may be because they don't have the ability to read in English. It may be because they don't have the ability to read, period. It may be because you're visually impaired. There can be a lot of things that those can actually restrict if you can't have assistance at the polls. That's the first thing I want to point out. So technically a written ballot, and I'm not saying we shouldn't have written ballots. Let me be very clear on that. I'm saying though, that if it denies the ability to have assistance, that is actually a literacy test. So saying we never had a literacy test is inaccurate. The second thing though is in 1918 when there was a women's suffrage primary law passed, which meant that technically it allowed women in the right to vote in Texas to vote in political party primaries starting in 1918. The political party primaries in Texas, primary elections were segregated based on race. They were called white primaries. There's not a white primary law statewide until 1923. And so this is 5 years before. You can do the math on what's going on there. But it was practiced by the parties. And so it's not all women gain the right to vote in the political primary in 1918 in Texas. It's very important. But for those that do or did have access, that there is also the only time it's written as a literacy test, there is a literacy test associated with that primary suffrage law. This is not what some of the main suffragists in Texas had been calling for. It's not the primary law that they had passed on to legislators and were lobbying for. And they're writing back and forth about that. And I'm not trying to let anybody off the hook or apologize or white apologist or anything like that. That's not my point. My point is that wasn't originally part of the intent, but the legislature added that. And I think that's also very important to say that laws can, even though some deals are being made, once things go through the legislature and they're being batted back and forth within the legislature, within the House and the Senate, and before it goes to the governor for signature, you can have additional things added. And voting laws see this happen very, very regularly throughout history. And up until present day. And so historically speaking, that's not unusual. But there are these restrictions. When that happened, there was requirements associated with that law in Texas too, which stated that, and you have to understand this is a new thing and people are trying to figure out what does it mean and how is it applied at the local level and who has access and who doesn't. And the Attorney General's office in Texas is issuing responses constantly, back and forth via newspaper, through information change, through letters to local voter registrars and clerks. And it's very complicated, and it's all happening within a few, it's passed in the spring of 1918, and it will go into effect that summer for the primary. There was just over 2 weeks for women across Texas to be registered to vote, go open for that. And so you have to understand how fast this is all happening. And one of the restrictions, or one of the requirements, was that women who lived in urban areas above a certain size had to register in advance. And so they had to, like I said, just about 2 weeks. It's a little over 2 weeks to register between late June and early July, leading up to the primary election. But they're not even, they're trying to explain that, they're trying to figure it out. And like I said, there's a locally applied expectation within the only party in Texas that's holding primaries and at that time, which is holding white primaries. So what does that mean, and how does this work with that, and does it not? And the Attorney General is not going to come out and say yes at that point, because technically that's hot water. And so they're trying to keep the women they don't want to vote from voting, and they're trying to keep the ones who do want to vote. And so that's all going back and forth. And then there's all this question of what does this mean? And in all of this, people are misinterpreting how the law is written. And an example of that is Ovidia Dodd, who was a Mexican revolutionary, and she's a journalist and an educator and an activist. And at that time, she's still living in Rodeo in South Texas, in the Valley area, right on the border. And she's started up a new newspaper, and she's publishing about this, and she's informing. It's a Spanish language newspaper. Her family's newspapers were always Spanish language, which I think are just fabulous, because you get to follow what was being published and what we're talking about. But that also means something, who she's talking to. It tells us a lot. It informs it. And she says that there's this wonderful, she doesn't say wonderful, let me put that. So she's excited, you can tell by her rhetoric, that she's excited that there's primary suffrage for women. She says, but only women in certain urban areas of a certain size are going to be able to vote. And in the readership of this, where she expects the vast majority of individuals who are reading and in South Texas and all that, where there's urban, that only means here and here. This is really important. She's an extremely intelligent human being. She's not dumb. It tells us something. And she's highly, highly informed and highly educated and very connected to what's going on. But she's not part of the suffrage circles, and she's not part of the political elites in Texas where she can get access to accurate information. And the law is so complicated that by its nature, it is creating discriminatory situations. And so the reason I'm pointing this out is there's this overt, you can't come in, you can't be part of a group, you can't vote in a primary, we're not going to let you, or physical violence. But there's also the way things are written, and access to information can purposely, and sometimes, although I don't think this was accidental, just be, you have discrimination that's created with this lack of information, or with highly complicated situations. And one of the number one things I've noticed it is used in creating discrimination voting is the more complicated you make it, the less likely people are to vote.
I think, Jessica, you hit on something very interesting, that it's historic, but at the same time, it's so current. Because I think, as a reporter, we're constantly saying, okay, now you can vote if you have an ID. Now you don't need an ID to vote. Now you do need an ID and you need a letter. Now you don't need a letter. Now you do need a bill. Now you need this. So all this confusion creates paralysis in voters, or in many voters, right? Or at least in a segment of voters. That was 2018. Now what are we dealing with in 2020? There's the census, but have you registered for the census? Okay, well, that's not the only thing you need to worry about. We also have a presidential election. Have you registered for that? Okay, good for you. But now, all these barriers of COVID, and do you get a mail-in ballot or not? And absentee ballot, and do you qualify for a disability or don't you qualify for a disability? Who qualifies for a disability? Again, all this confusion creates paralysis in a certain segment of voters. And let me just throw one additional wrench in there. Because we've had these conversations, because I've been listening to your lectures, I've been thinking about the Electoral College as one of those tools in which create paralysis, because it's so complicated. Because when you look at Texas voters, you look at 17% of the population in Texas, roughly 5 million Texans are foreign born. That doesn't tell us that they cannot vote. It just tells us it's a foreign born population. The majority of them are authorized to be in Texas, just a very small number are not, which tells me that some are in the path of becoming citizens or are citizens already. But when you come from other countries, when you have 5 million people coming from other countries where all you need to do is show up and vote, and here you're like, okay, you need to tie your left shoe, but not your right shoe. And you need to stand on your tippy toes if you're a Democrat, but stand on your fingertips if you're a Republican, and you need to tell us a joke and it better be a good one or you cannot vote. Oh, and if this many people in the state vote, then our 38 points go to this player. It's like, what? It's super complicated, super complicated. 5 million people in the state of Texas come from a different background. If American-born Americans do not understand the Electoral College, foreign-born Americans, we are left with a lot of question marks on our face, beyond COVID, beyond, whether you need an ID or not. So confusion creates voter paralysis, is my 2 cents.
Like, I really loved reading about Maud Sampson Williams, Will you talk a little bit more about her? Because she grew up in Austin. Her dad ran a grocery stand downtown. She, I found where she lived on the map in Austin.
That is so beautiful, yeah.
There. And then she went to Prairie View A&M, and then she got her first real teaching job in El Paso. And I got to find where she lived in El Paso. But can you talk about, because she seemed like a passionate voter. Can you talk a little bit more about her? Her family was African American, and she ended up spending, I think how you said, the majority of her time advocating for the NAACP because she'd gotten then kind of kicked out of the suffrage movement.
Well, but I think that's how we look at it if we look at it from the women's suffrage perspective. But I think we need to flip that, and we need to realize that the NAACP is a suffrage organization, period, from the very beginning. Mm-hmm. And it's a place where women and men can come together and advocate on behalf of African American populations for the access to vote. And since women do not have the right to vote in the vast majority of states in the United States at the time the NAACP, we'll call it nationally solidified, nothing. It's one of the things that I looked for all my career, I've looked for, the suffragist or the individual or the group that just pops up out of the blue, no connection, anything else. It doesn't happen that way. I'm not going to say it universally, but I've been looking for decades, and it's just, it's informed by other things. That's how people get involved, whatever that is. And so there are plenty of clubs and organizations and national movement, portions of the national movement, civil rights movement that exist that come together, and part of it comes together to form the NAACP in the 1900s. And at that point, most women throughout most of the United States don't have the right to vote. So it makes a lot of sense that that's going to be also one of the things that's happening within the halls. And so we have to look at the NAACP as a suffrage organization as well, partially because of segregation and what we would call the main suffrage organizations, but also because it's going to happen there.
The NAACP was started by women. It was always involved women. They always considered the networking that women had and have always capitalized on it. So
she's a lifelong NAACPer because it speaks to who she is as an activist, and because that's the community identity that she can invest in and invest in her as a leader, basically, is the way I put that. So she's very interesting, but I want to point out first that how that happened was very interesting. Celia's been on this path with me for a long time.
I love the story of how, when I interviewed you, you said how you were looking for her.
I was looking for her. Historians have been looking for her for decades. There's a couple of letters actually, but a letter from her. It's a couple line letters in the Jane McCallum papers that you mentioned earlier, Jennifer. And there's a few letters back and forth, including one that's actually in another collection with her and NASA, or National American Women's Suffrage Association, which is a national affiliate for the Texas Equal Suffrage Association, which is what Minnie Fisher Cunningham is president of at this point. This is all happening about the time of the primary suffrage law being passed in 1918. And we knew, historians have known for decades, that there was this woman in El Paso that wrote this letter that said, I'd like to affiliate this club. And because of the other correspondence, the other letters back and forth between white suffragists in NASA and white suffrage leaders at the Texas level, and then also in El Paso, we learned she's African American. She never mentions her racial identity in this couple of line letter, which also is really important, because she's not saying my African American Women's Club. She says that she's the head of a suffrage league in El Paso. Well, that would have triggered El Paso. I mean, that would have triggered nationals, because they know there's already a suffrage league. So why is there two? And so whenever at some point they find out she's African American, we don't have that correspondence. I have a feeling that that's back and forth between El Paso suffragists, and we just probably don't ever have those correspondence turned over. Anyway, so we know about this, but we knew very little. A couple of other historians prior to me did look her up in the census, so we knew a little bit, but she was one of the individuals that I wanted to know more about. And I just kept coming back to her over and over and over again for almost 20 years, because I knew there was a story there. I know it, and I know enough about El Paso's NAACP activist history to know, and the size of the African American community in El Paso, that there was no way they didn't all know each other. 2 out of 3 of the main, there are other court cases, but the main United States Supreme Court cases that overturned the white primary, now they all come out of Texas, but this is a national overturn, okay, happen out of El Paso NAACP. And I was saying, this is not an accident. This is just 10 years before. There's no way. So there's Nixon versus Herndon in 1927, Nixon versus Condon in 1932. Those are both out of El Paso. And then there's Smith versus Allwright out of Houston in 1944. United States Supreme Court cases. So I just knew there was a story there we just couldn't find. And I kept coming back to it and kept coming back to it. Ironically, this is what happens when you spend too much time on a book, that you get to find the things you always wanted and it gets to go in the book. Because I published other things in between. But what happened was I found a little bit here and I found a little bit there, and I was able. And then newspapers were digitized, and digitization is actually one of the main things that led to this, and that's also why I want to say we're going to learn so much more about suffrage history in the next 10 or 15 years than we ever learned in the last century.
Yes.
Because we're going to just have access to more, and also I ask questions. And so the El Paso, it's a white-owned newspaper, but they're reporting a lot about the African American community in El Paso. Was digitized by the Portal of Texas, and I got to find information about her at that time, but I lost her in 1927. I couldn't find her anymore, and I thought, all right, did she die? Did she move?
Yeah.
Or did she got married? Or did she's not on the map. She's not in the city directory. She's not anywhere. I've looked, and I always had the suspicion that I never was able to find that she had any children with this first marriage, which was Maud Sampson. Sampson was her first married name, and her maiden name's Craig, and that's where she's buried, in the Craig family plot area that you mentioned earlier in Austin. And I call every once in a while, call the county clerk's office, and I'm like, hey, do you have anything? And they couldn't find her. And then I started asking, have you digitized? And about every year or so, 6 months, I'm like, I come around, I'm working on a manuscript, I'm working on an article. I'm like, man, I would really like to know what happened here to be able to work on this. So I'd call them again. They're like, no, ma'am. And I don't know if I was getting the same person, and they were like, yeah, it's 2 a.m. on Tuesday, the second Tuesday of October. Wranosky's going to call again. I don't know. But over the years, like stalker. But over the years, one day they called, they said, yeah, it's been all digitized. Here's the hyperlink. And I was like, oh. So, I think at that point I called Seal and said, Seal, I haven't looked. Or maybe I had just looked. And I searched her under Maud Sampson, and the records about the land that she inherited from her first husband when he passed away mentioned her new married name. And that's when I realized she was Maud Williams. And I also found out that so I'm Googling. I go, who's Maud Williams? Like, is there anything?
I've heard this story, but my hairs are sticking up.
And I'm Googling, and again, digitization. So Emma Clark Shabbat's has a book called Advancing Democracy about the desegregation of higher ed in Texas. And it's not fully available in Google Books, but you can, and I'm searching Maud Williams and Emerson Williams and Mrs. E.M. Williams and anything I can find, and it pops up. And I realize, oh my God. In 1954, a few months after the Supreme Court ruling on Brown versus Board of the Education of Topeka, Kansas, Maud Williams, Mrs. E.M. Williams, goes with a young woman named Thelma White to, at the time it was Texas Western College. We now know it is University of Texas at El Paso. It was part of, it becomes part of the UT system at that time, but goes to Texas Western for Thelma White, who had been the African-American valedictorian from the local African-American high school, to try to register Thelma White for school at Texas Western for that year, and was turned away because she was African-American. And I was like, oh my God, because you got to remember, what I had on her was 1918, and this is 1954.
Yeah.
And it's just hitting so many things. So then I went, all right, I'm looking for the same person. Here are basically our bookends. And then I start looking backwards. Because once I found what her married name was, then I could find the death certificate. The death certificate tells me what her parents' names were. And then I can go backward from 1918 and I can find out, oh, she grew up in Austin. Oh, her dad was a grocer. Oh, that makes a lot of sense. And I can find her siblings and realize a number of her siblings received higher education. And you start constructing the story about this middle-class African-American young woman who grew up in Austin, whose parents had access to resources that provided her that education, that then leads her to seek a professional career in El Paso. Mm-hmm. She's the one around her is who forms the first, or we would now call it the Parent-Teacher Association. They would have called it the Mothers Club back then, for the African-American school in El Paso. And you realize there's this life of activism and organizing around this community that's so important to the national level as far as desegregation to the right to vote. And you have a woman at the center of it. Also, I didn't mention when she writes that letter in 1918 and is turned away eventually, and our club is not allowed to affiliate directly with the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And more so, Carrie Chapman Catt told the white state level suffrage leaders in Texas, make it go away, make it stop. I wouldn't have her affiliated in Texas either. You're going to blow this. That she's also at the same time the vice president of the local NAACP, and had been for about a year or two at that point, and is for a number of years after. She's not vice president by the time Nixon versus Herndon and Nixon versus Condon are heard and ruled on by the United States Supreme Court in 1927 and 32, but we know she continues at the NAACP, and she is on some membership roles throughout the years, but by the time 1954 comes around, and she had been for a while before that, she's the chair of the Legal Redress Committee for that NAACP in El Paso. And this is an extremely well-connected, powerful NAACP. It's also the first NAACP in Texas, first branch in Texas. And so this says a lot. It says a lot about her as an activist. It says a lot about what suffrage meant to people, that suffrage does not happen in a bubble. It's part of people's lifelines, or lifetime lines, that people are active in suffrage because of what they're interested in and what they're doing. And they will take it in many, many different directions. What we often call the quote unquote typical suffrage movement leading up to 1920 and the ratification of the 19th Amendment. Not all women gain the right to vote at the ratification of the 19th Amendment. Other restrictions are placed, or other restrictions exist, whether they're legal or whether they're social, cultural, and infrastructural in that way, for example, violence and intimidation as well. And we see who is interested in suffrage leading up to 1920 or in the years following, and how that informs or is connected to what they do later and how they come to the movement. And while this is very much an NAACP story, and it's very much a African-American community story, it also should inform us on who we're looking for and how we're looking for it. We need to be looking for it in different ways, and I think a lot of the suffrage history in the past is done. And when you find leads, I've teased for years, Seal's egged me on about this too, so have a number of other people. Eventually I'm going to write an article, maybe not, who knows, all the to-be lists, but something like, because a long time ago, I was asked something at a panel, and I said, well, if it walks like a duck and it talks like a duck, right? Yeah. And at the time, I was talking about racism within the suffrage movement, but you could say the same thing about suffragists. That's how I've located people over the years. The rest of what they're doing looks a lot like they're probably suffragists. I need to keep going. That's how I kept looking for articles. I think Gabriela Gonzalez, who is the biographer for Ovidiedad, and I probably came across this about the same time. We just didn't know it yet. So I don't know. I know anyway, I didn't have access to her work. I don't know what she had access to mine, but I believe we both probably came across it independently at the same time, because when you're looking for certain things, you're looking for certain things. And I was determined that, that sounds very anti-historical. We don't make history happen. Let me rephrase that. I was sure that Ovidiedad was a suffragist, but I just had to find it. And she was publishing under so many pen names during those years in the different newspapers in 1910, you had to know what they were. And you have to get access to those. Again, those were a lot of time digital newspapers. And but when you start realizing that it's not just individuals that are part of these suffrage, or these especially predominantly white suffrage organizations, if not completely white suffrage organizations that you call suffragists, but that suffragists are individuals that are acting publicly on behalf of suffrage, their own or other individuals, through through their advocacy, through their activism, through their journalism, through their writing, through their communication and organizing or outreach with their neighbors. Those are also suffragists. Then we start looking for different ways you can identify suffragists other than a membership list.
So
And we should also look at different organizations too.
it sounds like you and Cecilia have some really master tips on researching. So can you share with us some of your tips on how to find people in paper, though we can't access them much right now, and online? Like,
So why don't you go first and talk about NAACP?
Yeah, I was going to say you really have to look at the community that you're looking at. The reason that Maud Sampson was so active in El Paso is, and you consider what's in El Paso, but El Paso had at the time, a growing middle class of African Americans because of the professionalization that was coming in there, because of the railroad that was there. This is where, a lot of the Pullman porters and things like that. So therefore, you're having an income increase that can support this, because you need people to not only be educated, but you also need to have people to have somewhat extra time to get involved with a lot of this stuff. If they're working 3 or 4 jobs, they don't have the time. So this
is a great story for the radio, let me tell you.
Yes. Go ahead. I want to listen.
No, I think it is a great story for the radio, because to think about all the things, I just finished a story about how, the Asian American community, we can trace sort of its birth or its rooting in Texas because of the railroad, obviously. Yeah. But this is another layer of a railroad story of, middle class activism, because you're right, to become an activist, you have to have a meal that is, you have to arrive home and there should be a meal for you.
Yes.
So it is something that if you're middle class, it's easier to do.
I want to add to that too. It's not just that, but also it helps enormously to have at least a portion of that community to have independent employment and professional access. Doctors, attorneys, seamstresses who can't be fired.
Right. You have to have that professionalization within your neighborhood or within your community. So yes, and you have to have, like you said, independent, where you're not relying on a different community to support you. Because you can't feel like you're going to be intimidated.
And
as the journalist whose dad owned a newspaper, right, or that kind of thing.
Yeah,
right.
And that's one of the ways to follow that. Absolutely.
And that's to have the part-time job, or sometimes full-time on top of your day job of being an activist. So the same thing goes for being able to vote. Is you have to be able to leave work and stand in line for an unknown amount of time. You have to be able to find the poll, the voting location, whether it's early voting or day of. Yes. It was interesting in a recent election that in one county there was no line, and in another county there were lines that lasted all day long.
Well, Texas is notorious since 2013 when they redid the Supreme Court ruling in 1965, cutting out Section 5, where the state of Texas can change anything that they want to change. And they have taken a lot of the structures out of Black and brown neighborhoods. And so that has, not only can you not take off a day to go vote, or you have to vote between a certain time, you also have to find where they're allowing you to vote. And so that's why, like you said, you have the lines that are, miles long in one place and nobody in the other place. So that is another way of disfranchising a lot of people to vote.
Mm-hmm. I want to actually add something to what we were talking about earlier about how to find these individuals in history too. I think Sil mentioned something about, the networks and what's set up. Universities played an enormous part. They still do. Their locations where information is exchanged. And you also have to think about universities as a place that the individuals who attend university, who are either university students, who are members of the community, whatever that means, whether it's local community around that university or college, whether that means, larger service community who seek information or access or services or connection in some way from the college or university, but also the faculty, the administration. These are places where individuals are self-selecting to be part of this community. And so they're seeking knowledge, they're seeking access, they're seeking information, they're seeking networks. So we also have to keep that in mind. But it's a place where ideas are the main product. And people who are looking to exchange ideas seek out colleges and universities and in that way, in whatever role it is. And that's a place where we see a lot of suffrage organizing, a lot of things that are passed along as far back as the 19th century, what we would call early U.S. suffragists. One of the things that I think is most telling is who we consider some of the earliest and most famous suffragists in U.S. history. Find each other that way, or find each other through activist communities and reform communities, and we're talking like back to the antebellum period, in some way, shape, or form like that. And they're also the women who would have been likely at that point when higher education is enormously restricted based on sex. So most women couldn't and didn't have access in the United States, or the colleges and universities, and also some of the early suffragists are some of the first ordained women ministers in the nation.
I am so glad that you mentioned that, because I was going to say that for me, the community of faith has been very, very helpful. In public radio, a lot of people, I think in the last 3 years, maybe 5 years, people have let their guard down a little bit. But because I am the child of a minister and the child of a very politically active minister, I know that the two are not against each other, No,
it's actually usually very overlapping.
Absolutely.
That's one of the things when you're looking for people, you need to look at where they're, what spaces are they, communicating in. And oftentimes it's the churches. I mean, when I looked for men, I was looking who they hunting with,
Yes.
For women, it's like, what groups are they involved with? And usually it's church, it's a quilting bee. It's something, that they're, expressing ideas. And this is, the start of their networks. And so that's.
And I think when well taught, the Bible is about social justice and faith in other faiths is about, righting wrongs and loving your neighbor and elevating your neighbor. And so in all faiths, so that has to do with voting, and that has to do with human rights, and that has to do with protecting the environment and, protecting the rights of children. And so to me, it's one of the places where I go. And I wanted to mention that when you look at the project, the 100-year project, if you go there, well, it truly was a project of love. But I had made a firm commitment to have women who were Republicans and women who were Democrats, women who were young and women who were old, and women who were of every color that we have in Texas. I made a commitment to do that. And I think that's one of the commitments that both Jessica, both Cecilia have, to look for a more holistic picture, not just one frame of the picture, but kind of do a panoramic. And 100 years from now, what will the women voters learn from us? Hopefully that we were more inclusive than our predecessors. Hopefully, yes, we had better tools than they had, but we made a conscious effort to include more women under the tent and to open more doors. Well, if you look at that project, my heart breaks a little bit because 2 of the women have died. And I was going to say they were some of my favorite, but honestly, all of them were my favorite. And as a mom, I can say that all of them are my favorite. And it's true. It's true. When I was pregnant with my second child, I was very scared that I wouldn't love him. You know, I was like, I don't think I'm going to love this child because I really love my first child. But actually, the miracle happens, right? And you do love him. So when you look at when you look at that project, the 100 years, and please, nobody say this to Maxine, but Maxine is the oldest woman in that series, and she turned 100 last year. And so she has the same birthday as the League of Women Voters in Texas. And not only does she share a birthday with the League of Women Voters in Texas, but she was the president of several leagues of women voters in Texas. So it was very important for me to interview her. And it was very important for me to get a photographer there and do a beautiful portrait of her because she was 100 and I thought that she was going to drop dead at any moment. God forgive me, right? And
this
don't
is something historians and journalists are frightened of on a minute basis, that we're going to not do justice to the folks whose histories, documents, oral histories, whatever, interviews that you need to do before the cast.
That was one of my biggest, stressors during this series. Well, I am happy to report that Maxine Barkin is doing fine. We were scheduled to have lunch for her birthday, just lunch right before COVID. And then she's like, I'm sorry, I cannot see you because of COVID. But we talked a couple of weeks ago and she's doing fine. But 2 of the women have died. The woman from Puerto Rico, oh gosh, I just lost her name. And the woman from Rio Grande City.
Dang it.
Daria.
Dang it, both of them, by the way, folks. I was just waiting for her to say the second one before I interrupted.
Yeah.
Oh.
So they both died, but it was so beautiful to have their stories there because both of their families asked if they could play their story at the funeral. And it's emotional because
It's okay, do it.
But the majority of us know each other as women, right? And then sometimes we know each other for our professional lives. And sometimes we know each other as mothers. And sometimes we know each other as church or not churchgoers or whatever our hobbies are and other interests. But very few of us call each other a fighter for women's rights. And their families finally saw them as that, as warriors for the rights of other women. And their eyes were opened like, oh my gosh, we live with heroines, Our mom is a heroine or our sister was a heroine. And so they played their stories on their funerals and it just makes me cry. Daria just died last month. So it's a little emotional for me.
And that's okay. I mean, that's the thing about this, right? We're as journalists, as historians, as which I don't see much of a separation. It's all about audience
telling stories,
and what our modes are. But we need to be objective when we're telling these stories. But it doesn't mean that we're not connected to what we're doing.
Yeah.
I always say, historian heal thyself. In other words, we're drawn to the stories we tell for a reason.
Absolutely.
Whatever it is, it doesn't mean that we're not interested. I mean, it's a very boring life to spend your life telling stories you don't care about. But it doesn't mean we're less objective if we're good at what we do.
Absolutely. And, the story of Daria is the story that I opened the conference that you attended, Jennifer, that she's the woman who laid on a bridge, who blocked an international bridge with her body, to prevent labor injustice. And why was she able to do that? Because she was an American who didn't speak English, by the way. third generation Texan who doesn't speak English, and her mother didn't speak English, and her grandmother didn't speak English. You know, it's like all these realities that make up who we are, and they're not any less legitimate than anybody else's story. So, I mean, talk about a superhero, you know, when we read stories to our children, there's always this aspiration of being like superheroes, but being a real life superhero demands so much and gets so little respect in return that I am amazed by women like Maud, who for 50 years continued, and, you know, they got no thank yous, they got no money.
There are stories about people remembering people even within the NAACP community who were a little worried at some points, by God, she's going to get us in trouble. She's not in trouble, that's not the right word. She's going to cause
Get us kicked out. Or
Negative
it's going to be a explosion, because she was just push, go. And I also find that interesting.
Yeah.
Because there's no way to ask those folks. They're all gone, who we're talking about. On, you know, was it like that with Lawrence Nixon? Were you worried about the male leadership in the community causing blowback? Is there something you all would like? Is she not following through with whatever your methods or procedures are? And I'm not trying to be funny. I'm not like, it's not like a gavel and Robert's Rules of Order kind of procedure. I mean, is there kind of a way that they would do things as a community and pre-decide what was pushed and what wasn't? And she's not following that rule? Or are you not letting her follow that rule because she's a woman? Does she not have, or is this more like she has more energy than you all have ever thought of? You know, I mean, the 1950s for her, and I've written stuff on suffrage, and I connected to suffrage, and I wrote the Handbook of Texas Women entry on it, and that's informed a whole lot of things. And because I wanted to get that out, I didn't want the book to have to wait to come out. Still, and I co-authored an article in
Sala's education.
The Association for the Association of Study for African American Life and History are the founders of Black History Month. It's the organization that created all of this, and in that way anyway. And the ones lobbied for it and put it together. It was originally African American. It was Black History Week, and then they have a couple of journals, and one of them is specifically for educators. And we co-authored an article this past year that came out. It's for primary and secondary educators mostly. And it's part of the reason we said yes, because we wanted to get these stories out for the teachers. And it's about the NAACP in the South with women's suffrage. But we wanted to make sure, but Seal was totally on board for that, the Maud Sampson Williams story was in there. But there's actually a lot more to be done on her 1950s life that I probably won't do, or anytime soon anyway, but she's doing all sorts of stuff. She's a homeowner, she's a property owner. So she's addressing the city council and saying, hey, I know that you all are using a percentage of the tax base to create public housing. How much of that percentage of public housing is going to the African American community? Mm-hmm. And she's, you know, and all the way back to the 19-teens, addressing public recreation space for African American communities. And one of the things they were lobbying for in the teens was a tennis court for the African American community. And, you know, we think about this in these spaces, and we think about her as the voting rights, or we think about her as, you know, there's major things that have been talked about with her. But we need to remember an activist is an activist, and they're usually associated with a lot of things in that way. But I find it even interesting that the activist community with El Paso were actually concerned sometimes, because she's so, and I don't know what that means, because we don't have personal papers for her.
Game changers and world changers are not always pleasant people.
But you're talking about game changers and world changers in that community. So is it because she was a woman and she's breaking those gender norms? And I have a hard time believing that. So what is it exactly? We'll never know completely. We'll never be able to say, oh, so she did it this way and they wanted her to do this way. But because then you have to then ask the question, but would you have let her do it this way? Right. Were you listening to women at this point?
And sometimes with women, it's so many things, right? For instance, If you are married, there's the code of the things that you're supposed to do and you're not supposed to do. If you have children, if you do not have children, if you do not have children, why don't you have children? And how can you be an activist for X, Y, or Z if you don't have children? There's so many codes that we have to abide when we are females in this society that I'm surprised we've made it this far. But I'm also encouraged. I'm also encouraged because it means that we can do it. We can make the final push for so many other things that are still left undone.
I've been part of a lot of conversations where people would say, why don't you just take no for the answer? The answer was no. We are all listening to that.
I had a boss who would always tell me, remember this phrase, the path of least resistance. And I was offended.
My answer to that is globally. Women, men, doesn't matter. If no was accepted over and over and over again, not a single thing in human history would have changed.
That's
Absolutely.
right.
Change always comes from not taking no for an answer.
Mm-hmm.
And it may not be a spoken no, it may not be an aggressive no, it may just be, no, I don't want that, I want bananas. You know, instead of apple today for lunch, I want a banana, right? You're telling yourself, no, I don't want that. But it's taking a no for an answer, then absolutely no change would have happened in history. And that I think it leaves us in one of the last things that I hope we get, I'd like to say before we all log off, which is, we've talked a lot about lack of access for voting and discrimination and confusion, but as individual voters, we need to not take any no's for an answer, and we need to make sure that we vote. Mm-hmm. And we need to do whatever that means to be able to get access to that vote as safely as we can, that we have access to, whatever that means.
Voting is power.
It'll go away. We'll lose. Rights won are not rights permanently won.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, voting is power. And if you don't vote, you lose power. I had an activist friend who sat in a community and they were going to close a school in a black and brown area, and they felt the city felt comfortable doing that because she was in the audience, and they told her, well, she overheard them say, don't worry about it. These people don't vote. They don't matter. And so if you need to matter, you need to vote. And they took the lawsuit and they won because of that. So it's an important aspect that we do need to vote because we do matter.
And that's not a 1915 story either.
No, it is not.
That's all I'm going to say. Also, I guess in connection to the larger thing as well, that it's not just voting, and it's not, we mentioned earlier about church communities and things, and I think this is something else, that voting is an act of community. It's investing in the fact that you're going to have a voice as part of the community, and the community is going to provide you with a voice, but it's also that you see yourself as, is your voice mattering to the community, but also that you're invested in that community. Because while voting and political access to issues affect people personally, you're part of a group when you vote, and you need to want to be part of that group, and that is also an investment. And so, that goes back to what we were saying. Absolutely. And
I think as you said before we part, I always, when I interview people, well, not always, but often when I interview people, I tell them, if we never met again, what is something you want me to know? And I think if we never met again, one thought that I want you to have is that it tells a lot about our intentions and how, we hark a lot about the founding fathers, but the founding fathers did not put the right to vote as a constitutional right. And it says a lot. It tells me that it's so powerful, right? As a right, that it was not given to us.
Not universally given.
So
that's
we
important.
have to preserve it, we have
Not
to
universally
respect it,
defined.
and we have to fight for it.
We do.
Right.
So,
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, you know, it's not something that we can go and say, we all have the right to vote, because we don't. Not universally given. Thank you. The right choice of words.
Yeah, I mean,
is
you have to
important.
make sure that you protect that right and that laws are not trying to restrict it. It looks like Megan wants to say something.
Hi, thank y'all so much for being here with us today. I really enjoyed the conversation a lot. Really appreciate your time. I ran across this from the New York Times on Wednesday. It's the Women's Reflections. That's backwards. It's called A Century After Suffrage, Women Reflect on Voting. And it is such a good part of the main part of the paper. And I was so thrilled. There are women, Madeleine Albright, famous women, someone 110 years old talking about voting and how it was for her growing up. This is the first one. I was so thrilled to see a 13-year-old saying that, you know, their kids are smarter than a lot of adults. And we don't have the right to vote yet, but there are lots of things we can do as kids. And I pull this out. I have a 13-year-old that I mentor who didn't have a family like probably we all had that teaches these things about citizenship and voting, and it's special that we can do this. And I'm going to give this to her, and I think we're going to have a good conversation about it next time we get to talk. So
I think that's great. And I want to throw something out really quickly in response to that. I won't go into a lot of detail because I mean, I know we're all kind of ready to go, but there is something I think that was tried a while back that I would like to see brought back, and I'm not volunteering, but I do think that to do myself, because it's bigger than that. But there have been projects done by League of Women Voters here in Texas and local areas over the years, where they had faux ballots printed out and faux ballot boxes created and took it into the schools and had the kids work through the voting process and everything else, and then did some unofficial follow-up where the students years later would reach back around, or they knew who they were and whatever. And we were talking the schools that they would go in were specifically in underrepresented communities, and looking at the kinds of effects that had. It's not a scientific study. It's not the kind of thing where you can have the statistical response, but I anecdotally know who was doing it and what they were doing, but it's something we really should think about as far as school structures are concerned, not voting in connection to like the class president, but setting up this, how do you find information? Where are these things in the public? What is it to vote? What is it to register to vote? What are these things to select? Because when those things are brought to these students and time is given so that they understand very young, I'm talking elementary school young, early junior high young, that this is really important, that it becomes a part of who they are in a way that other things I think may not, or they may not have access later. And so, and having local leaders come in and work with these students and they get to see them. It's one thing for it to be a one-day thing, or you see it in a textbook. It's a whole other thing. And so what you were saying about the mentoring that you do and bringing that up, in my opinion, I think that's one of the most effective things to create a invested citizenship. And I'm sorry to use that word, but that's how we define voters in the United States. But an invested voter community is having young people do that. And so yay. I'm glad you're going to do it. I think that's a great idea. I'm also really glad to see all of the press that's been done with this, you know, and how that overlaps with the election year. I mean, all of this 100 years ago was an election year also. So it's not an accident that we're following in a presidential election year, and it's the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment being ratified and all those kinds of things. That there was an investment at the time 100 years ago that for a number of individuals that were in power in Congress, that were in power in state legislatures, all this kind of thing, that for whatever reason, that even though they've very much saw and applied it as a restricted amount of women being able to vote, they saw it as politically advantageous to those individuals that were pushing that, who were in office. And we see this again. And so it's not an accident, but the fact that election year on top of the centennial, on top of, this is actually the first time since 1920 that we've had a major anniversary for the ratification of the 19th Amendment fall on election year, because all the others are not divided by 4.
Right.
And so that's also an interest. Centennials also bring a lot of interest. It's 100 anniversaries bring actually more interest than 300 anniversaries. And so we're seeing a big explosion with that. And but it's interesting. I'm glad you're going to do that. I'm so happy to see all the media coverage and all of the projects and all of the T-shirts and all of the digital projects and all of the public talks and events and just all the stuff associated with the suffrage amendment centennial also play itself out in pushing mobilization and engagement and community involvement.
I'm saddened for the people who won't be able to vote, because due to COVID, all the people who were scheduled to become citizens, they could have,
Right.
you know, had they become citizens, they could have registered to vote in time for this election. They won't be able to, because due to COVID, they're not doing national naturalization ceremonies.
Yeah, very, very few have happened in
Yeah.
the last few months. It's happened a little bit, very, 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 very few. After.
I know that's one of the beautiful perks of going through your naturalization ceremony, is registering to vote and voting in your first election. But well, thank you.
Thank you all for taking the time today to share your thoughts and experiences. And I really appreciate the opportunity to learn from you. So thank you.
Jennifer, your project was amazing.
It's wonderful. I'm so excited about it.
It's great.
Thank you all so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
All right. Have a good
Bye.
weekend.
Okay.
Bye.